Most fear doesn't feel like fear. That's the problem. If it announced itself, racing heart, shaking hands, the whole thing, you'd deal with it, you'd name it, you'd probably pray about it. But the fears that actually run your life don't do that. They show up wearing better clothes. They arrive dressed as being sensible, as being responsible, as not wanting to make a scene, as loving your family enough to worry about them. You never say, "I'm afraid." You say, "I'm just being realistic." Charles Spurgeon spent 40 years preaching to people who did exactly that, and across his sermons he keeps circling back to the same handful. Not dramatic fears, not persecution, not martyrdom, nothing you'd put in a hymn. Quiet, respectable, socially rewarded fears that he said were hollowing people out from the inside while they sat in a pew every Sunday looking completely fine. I recognized 4 of them in myself. Let's go through all 5. Quick word on why Spurgeon in particular. Because this is a man who had every reason to be afraid, and who wrote about it in public instead of pretending otherwise. He became famous at 19. By his early 20s, he was the most talked about preacher in London, and that meant the newspapers came for him, mocked in print, called a showman, called a fraud, caricatured. He was reading that about himself before he turned 25. At 22, he stood on a platform at the Surrey Gardens Music Hall when someone shouted fire, and 7 people died in the crush. I made a whole video about what that did to him. He never fully recovered. His body attacked him for most of his adult life. Gout, rheumatism, kidney disease. His wife Susanna became a chronic invalid in her 30s. And near the end, in the controversy that broke his relationship with his own denomination, men he had known for decades turned on him publicly. So when Spurgeon talks about fear, he isn't theorizing. He is a man who was publicly humiliated, physically broken, who watched people die in front of him and was abandoned by his own institution, writing about what fear does to a person, from inside it. That's why I trust him here, not because he conquered fear. Because he clearly didn't, and said so anyway. Fear 1. The fear of what people think. Spurgeon preached a sermon on this in March of 1874 at the Metropolitan Tabernacle. He took it from Proverbs, from the line about the fear of man bringing a snare. And what he does with it is name the thing precisely. He calls it the fear of losing human approbation and the fear of incurring human wrath. Notice how exact that is. 2 directions. There's the fear of not being approved of, the withdrawal of warmth, the sense that people have gone slightly cool on you. And there's the fear of being actively disliked, of somebody being angry with you. Most of us are governed by one of the 2, and we usually know which. Then he gives an example, and this is the part that stopped me. He talks about ministers, preachers, his own profession, and he says that when a minister starts to be afraid of the people listening to him, what happens is that he begins withholding a doctrine because of a wealthy donor in the congregation, or he softens a rebuke because it would land too hard on somebody influential. Sit with that for a second. That is a preacher in 1874 in front of his own congregation, describing the exact mechanism by which a person in his position gets quietly bought, not with a bribe, just with the fear of one person's displeasure. And it isn't only preachers, obviously. Think about how this works in your week. You don't say something you actually believe because of who's in the room. You laugh at something you found ugly. You keep a friendship going that is quietly making you worse. because ending it would require a conversation. You present a version of your life online that runs a few degrees better than the real one. None of that feels like cowardice while you're doing it. Every single one of those has a reasonable name attached. Spurgeon's point is that the fear of man and the fear of God cannot both sit in the same chair. One of them is running you at any given moment. And most of us have never actually checked which one it is. Fear 2, the fear of tomorrow. This one is the most respectable of the 5, and I think the most common. We don't call it fear, we call it planning, being prepared, being, and Spurgeon would have enjoyed this, realistic. He preached on this on a Sunday morning in January of 1862 in a sermon he called A Cure for Care. The text was that line from Peter about casting all your care on him because he cares for you. You've heard that verse. It's on mugs. And Spurgeon points out something in it that I had never once noticed, and I don't think most people have. In the Greek, the 2 words for care in that sentence are not the same word. They're different words entirely. The care that you are told to throw off, that one means anxiety. The wearing kind, the kind that grinds you down. And the word used for what God does, the caring in He cares for you, is a completely different term. Spurgeon says it's the word used for looking after the poor, and elsewhere for the watchfulness of a shepherd. So the sentence is not saying, stop worrying, because God worries about it instead. It's saying your anxiety and God's care are 2 different things entirely. One of them is corroding you, the other one is watching over you, and you have been confusing them your whole life. He goes further in another sermon on the same verse. He says the enemy hopes to devour you by care. That anxiety isn't a side effect, it's a method. And his reason for casting it off is startlingly practical. He says, you need all your powers of thought for the actual fight, and if you're worried, you cannot be watchful. Anxiety doesn't prepare you for tomorrow, it disarms you before tomorrow arrives. Which means the exhaustion you feel isn't evidence that you can't handle what's coming. It's evidence that something has been quietly draining the equipment you'd need to. Fear 3, the fear of your own heart. This is the quietest one, and in my opinion, the most destructive. It's the fear that you are not actually a Christian, that you've been going through the motions convincingly for years, and that underneath it, the thing itself was never there. That you've fooled everyone, including yourself. Now, I assumed, going into this, that Spurgeon's answer would be gentle. Stop looking inward. Look to Christ instead. That's the modern answer, and it's a kind one. That is not what he says. He goes the opposite direction, and he's blunt about it. He says the genuine Christian is not averse to self-examination, that the real believer isn't frightened of the test. And then he says something that I found genuinely uncomfortable. He says it is a very ominous sign when a man is afraid of discussing his own spiritual state in the chamber of his own heart. An ominous sign, not of unbelief exactly, but of something being avoided. And here's his actual diagnosis, which flips the whole thing around. He says that many Christians live with doubts and fears about their own condition for one specific reason, because they have never had the matter out. Never settled it. Never sat down and genuinely asked the question, and stayed there until there was an answer. They've had the fear for 15 years and they've never once actually looked at it. So the fear isn't what I thought it was. The fear is not that the answer will be no. The fear is of asking the question at all, because as long as the question stays open, the answer can't be bad. You get to live in permanent suspension, and permanent suspension feels safer than a verdict. Except it isn't safer, it's just longer. And Spurgeon has one more line on this that I keep thinking about. He says a person in doubt about their salvation and unable to rest, that he understands completely. But a person in doubt about their reconciliation to God and yet perfectly happy about it, that, he says, is a mystery. Which is a quiet way of saying, if you have been carrying this for years and it doesn't disturb you enough to make you settle it, that itself is worth looking at. I don't find that comfortable. I don't think it's meant to be. But it's the first thing anyone has said on the subject that struck me as an actual instruction rather than a reassurance. Fear 4. The fear of losing someone. This one hides best of all, because it looks exactly like love. Spurgeon knew it from the inside. Susanna became seriously ill in her 30s and was largely housebound for much of their marriage. He watched her decline and then lived the rest of his life beside someone whose health could turn without warning. And there's a distinction here that I think is worth making carefully. There is a point where holding on to someone stops being about them and starts being about you, where you are no longer loving the person, you are managing the terror of a world without them. Those two things look identical from the outside. They feel identical from the inside, and they are not the same thing. One of them lets the person be a person. The other one turns them into the load-bearing wall of your entire life. The instruction was never to love them less. It's about where the weight rests. If everything you have is standing on one person, you will grip them in a way that is bad for you, and eventually bad for them, and the gripping will never once make them safer. That's the part that got me, actually. All that fear buys you nothing, not one extra hour. It doesn't protect anyone. It just costs you the years you had with them while you still had them. I'd argue this one sits underneath the other 4. Not because everyone lies awake thinking about dying. Most people don't. But because the other 4 are all versions of it. The fear of what people think is a fear of being erased socially. The fear of tomorrow is a fear of what's coming. The fear of your own heart is a fear of what happens after. The fear of losing someone is death arriving at somebody else first. Pull the thread on any of them, and you end up in the same room. Spurgeon talked about death far more than a modern preacher would, and partly he had no choice. Victorian London gave him none. Children died. Disease moved through the city in waves. He buried people constantly. And his own body kept telling him, from his 30s onward, that he was not going to be here long. He was right about that. He died at 57. Here's the thing I noticed, going through all of this. He never argues anyone out of the fear. Not one of the 5. He doesn't tell you it's irrational. He doesn't tell you to have more faith. He doesn't produce a verse and expect the feeling to leave. Which I think is because he knew perfectly well that it doesn't work like that, having tried it on himself for 40 years. What he does instead, 4 things. He names it out loud, in sermons, in print, in front of thousands of people. He refuses to let fear live in the dark, because a fear you won't say out loud grows, and a fear you say out loud at least stops growing. He settles what can be settled. That's the whole point of the 3rd fear. Don't carry an open question for 15 years. Have it out. He treats fear as physical. He noticed that his own fear was worse when his body was worse. and he treated the body accordingly. Rest, warmth, time away, months in the south of France. Not more prayer, rest. And he keeps going while still afraid. This is the one that matters most, and it's the least comfortable. There is no moment in Spurgeon's life where the fear resolves and then he acts. He preaches afraid. He works afraid. He goes back into the Surrey Gardens Music Hall, the actual building where 7 people died, and he preaches there again. Courage in Spurgeon is never the absence of the fear. It's what you do at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, with the fear still completely present. UK. So, what people think, tomorrow, your own heart, losing someone, death. And here's the inversion I keep coming back to. Every one of those has a respectable name. The fear of what people think is called being considerate. The fear of tomorrow is called being responsible. The fear of your own heart is called not presuming. The fear of losing someone is called love. The fear of death is called common sense. That's why they're quiet. That is the entire mechanism. They don't destroy your faith by attacking it. They destroy it by being praised. Nobody in your church is going to sit you down and say, "You appear to have organized your whole life around not being disliked." They're going to say you're easy to get along with. Nobody is going to say you've made your wife into the foundation of your existence. They're going to say you're devoted. Nobody is going to say you've kept a question open for a decade because you're afraid of the answer. They're going to say you're humble about it. Spurgeon's contribution is not that he beat these. He plainly didn't. He carried all 5 to the end. His contribution is that he refused to let them keep their disguises. He said them out loud, in public, in print, under his own name, in front of the people who admired him most. And I think that's the actual instruction. Not conquer the fear, just stop letting it wear a better word. I said at the start that I recognized 4 of these in myself. It's 5. I knew it was 5 when I started writing. I just wanted to keep one of them, because I'd been calling it something else for a long time, and I liked the name I'd given it. Father, for anyone watching who has been carrying one of these under a kinder name, give them the courage to call it what it is. Not the strength to defeat it, just the honesty to stop defending it. Amen. Next time, why Spurgeon refused, flatly, in print, to call sadness a sin. Take care of yourself.